fat loss is basically controlled starvation. The difference is that we're trying to look good naked and not starve to death. So today's video I'll be diving into two of the fat loss hormones, and there's a few different hormones that are affecting hunger and fat loss, but today we're mainly going to look at leptin and ghrelin. And to put it the simplest way possible, leptin is basically going to down-regulate hunger and food consumption, and ghrelin is basically going to up-regulate hunger and food consumption. So when we're looking at leptin is going to be the highest when we have a lot of fat storages and we're consuming a lot of food. So I want you guys to picture me back when I was obese. So back then I had an extra 93 pounds of body weight on my body, and more than 93 of those pounds were actually fat because I built some muscle now. So my fat storages were so much higher back then. I was consuming so much more calories because that was obviously the main reason why I got obese. So my leptin levels were extremely high, and that was supposed to downregulate my hunger. But what happened to me, and happens to a lot of obese people, is that our leptin is working just fine. It's just that we learned to ignore our leptin response, so we had something that was even stronger than it. So in my example, I had a lot of emotional issues. I was using food as a way to escape from my life. I was using food to cope with certain sadnesses. So what basically happened was that my leptin was working perfectly, but I basically learned to ignore that, or I became leptin resistant, so to speak. So even though the leptin was screaming at me, "Hey Matthias, you have way too much fat storages. You're consuming way too much food. You don't need this much, you can eat less." I completely ignored that, and it got overwritten by my craving for comfort, my craving for dopamine. All of that stuff was basically overriding the leptin response. So if we take a perfectly healthy human when they're eating, the leptin is going to go up, and the ghrelin is going to go down. And when we're looking at ghrelin, so this is on the other hand, ghrelin basically stimulates hunger and upregulates it. And what's interesting about ghrelin is that it's very dependent on our habits. So if you're used to eating first thing after waking up, your hunger is going to be very high after you're waking up. On the other hand, I'm doing intermittent fasting right now. I wait around 3 to 4 hours before I have my first meal. So in the morning, I'm not hungry because my ghrelin has adapted to my way of eating. And I really want you guys to remember that, because that's extremely important. And it doesn't happen like in a few days, but if we go a few weeks changing our eating habits, ghrelin is going to adapt to that. But if we're going back to leptin and the relationship between these two, so what makes it so hard to actually lose weight and sustain it? So just a moment ago you picture me as obese, but now I want you to picture back when I had a six-pack. I don't have a six-pack currently, but a few years ago when I had a six-pack, it was quite difficult for me to maintain that state, simply because my leptin was very low and my ghrelin was very high. And why was that? Because when I had a six-pack, my fat storage was very little. I was consuming very little calories because, like we said, I was controllably starving myself, so I would look good naked. So leptin was low, ghrelin was high, and like I said, that's why it's so damn hard to actually stick to those states when we're being that lean, because we're deprived of calories, our ghrelin is high, stimulating hunger, leptin is very low. So obviously it's not helpful to know about that, and you guys are probably thinking, yeah Matthias, I know fat loss is hard, and I know that it's just harder as I go by, but there's a few ways we can actually use this to our advantage. And one thing that I talk about a lot is basically sustainability. And the way we can take this into account when it comes to sustainability is that the bigger we create a calorie deficit, the harder our leptin is going to fall, the harder ghrelin is going to rise. So I want you guys to think about that. So if you create a 1000 calorie deficit, your leptin is going to be very low, your ghrelin is going to be very high. On the other hand, if you choose a 500 calorie deficit for one day, leptin is going to be slightly higher and ghrelin is going to be slightly lower, making it easier for you guys to stick to a calorie deficit. And I know I'll talk way too much about sustainability, you guys are probably bored of it, but it's so important to having this sustainable strategy, because as body fat storage reduces, as we're eating less food, we want to make everything sustainable, because if we're pushing too hard, it's not going to be sustainable. We're just going to regain all the weight that we lost. So don't push your deficits too hard. And the second one is simply going to be refeeds. And refeeds are not yet backed by scientific literature. I'm actually quite confident that they will be in the future, but they're not right now. So I'll just say that before I dive into them. And what a refeed is basically a control day of overfeeding. And what we usually do on a refeed day is that we have a very high carbohydrate intake. So let's say that I'm eating 2,000 calories on my diet right now, and my maintenance calories is 2,500. On my refeed day, I would increase my total calories to around 2,500, my maintenance. I would make that very high in carbohydrates. So all those 500 calories that I just added, all of those would be carbohydrates. I would even slightly reduce my protein and my fat intake, so I could move some of those to the carbohydrate intakes. What that is going to do is that's going to increase leptin in the short term, and it's going to decrease ghrelin in the short term. And there's also a huge psychological benefit to this, because if you guys have been dieting for some time and you have this day to look forward to, where you can actually do a controlled day of overeating that would bring you closer towards your goal, how awesome wouldn't that be? And that doesn't mean that it's a cheat meal or anything like that. It's just controlled overfeeding, and you're combining that with your most intense training day. So if legs is your most intense training day, you would have your refeed on leg day. On the other hand, if your back is a weak point of yours, having the refeed on your back day would also be a very viable strategy. So either on your most intense training day or one of your weak points to strengthen it is basically when we're going to want to put the refeed. And like I said, it's going to increase leptin in short term, and it's going to reduce ghrelin in short term. So a couple of guidelines for refeeds would basically be that the longer that you have been dieting, the more you want to utilize refeeds, if you utilize them at all, because refeeds are not necessary, but for me and a lot of people, we find them very beneficial, especially for those psychological aspects that I was talking about. And like I said, that's not backed by science, but me and a lot of other coaches has had great success with that when it comes to ourselves and our clients. So that are some of the ways that we can manipulate the hunger hormones into our favor, and hope you guys found this enjoyable and valuable. Take care.